Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the Studio Superfan brief, aka my time using action blocks. When choosing Studio Superfan, I went for Respawn purely because I love the IPs that they work on. I find a lot of the levels that they create a lot of fun to play with and incredibly immersive. So immediately when I chose them, I went online and I found a GDC talk from 2018 by Christopher Dion, who is a level designer from Respawn, talking about action blocks. So, what is an action block? Simply put, it's a quick, rapid form of prototyping that kind of skips the 2D pre-production side of things and gets straight into iterative 3D playable game jam style sprints. It makes them very quick, but it also makes them disposable. So if things are not going particularly well, you only spend a couple of hours on it, or you can very quickly dispose of it. It also means that in terms of full production, it's very cheap. There aren't any other departments involved. There's no art teams or anything like that. It's usually one designer, occasionally two, but generally speaking, it's very individual process, which means they can get a few designers creating a few action blocks, and by the end of a month or so, they'll have dozens of them to kind of pick and choose and iterate from. So that, again, they're very iterative. If things are working well, you can build on them very quickly and they become much more actionable. So how do you action block? Generally speaking, from the GDC talk, there will be some kind of skill test for the player involved, usually involving mechanics or some kind of puzzle. It's just some way to challenge the player, and that needs to be in every single one of them. There's no context at this point in time. You're not developing a whole level block out. You're not creating a level design. You're just quick scenarios, quick gameplay moments, as it were, that you can kind of build on over time. While context isn't needed, sometimes it can be, it's not dissuaded. I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to create quite early on, so I utilized that at an early stage. They should have as little time as possible spent on each block. Now in Respawn, they have a single designer working for about a week on an action block. Obviously, if they're having, they're banging their head against the wall with it, they'll just ditch it and start a new one and kind of move on from there. For Titanfall 2, that was about the time frame. For me, I don't have that time frame, so I aimed to spend a day at the very most working on these blocks, and they need to be playable. That's kind of the key feature of action blocks, is that they are iterative, they are playable, you get the immediate feedback from playtesting. It's to get it as quickly into playtesting as you can, so that you can pick up any of the faults, you can pick up any of the pros, and you can kind of develop that quickly. It's a lot more tactile. You're not spending a lot of time on top-down maps and pre-production level design documents. You're just kind of getting your ideas in a physical space that you can kind of work on from there. And clearly defining your gameplay limits is the last one. And this wasn't mentioned in the GDC talk. This was something that Pete mentioned to me post my pitch, actually, and it's something that I found very helpful. As designers, we've got 1,000 ideas bouncing around our brains at all times. Clearly defining where the limits are, what you want to be involved in this space, what you want to have there in the first place, and limiting that to a few things. It means you've got a very narrow road that you can kind of follow down. Those restrictions really give a lot more direction. So what were my restrictions? Well, immediately looking at all of Respawn's projects, they have an element of indoor-outdoor. For me, that's pretty vital. Spaces are, you can either start outdoors or start indoors, and you dip in and out. Puzzles will take you to different areas. You'll explore certain places. Platforms will kind of get you through. You have to bypass blockades by climbing out of windows and things like that. And I feel that encourages exploration in players from the get-go, and that in and of itself kind of programs them to utilize as much of the space as they have. Reset power. This was I think this was quite helpful because I wanted like an actionable goal rather than just being get to the exit or whatever. I wanted something that was tangible for them to follow. So for me was that in this facility that you're in, power's been lost in certain sections, and you essentially need to reroute that power in order to progress. I thought it was quite a simple one to use, but it has a lot of effective usages in terms of opening up playable space. You can have generators outside and things. Last Love House does this really well. That's kind of just it's a very simple idea but incredibly effective. Gunplay was kind of fundamental for me. I wanted there to be living obstacles that the player needed to interact with. I didn't contextualize them. Again, it wasn't necessary at this point in time, but the idea was that they were in your way, and the only way to get past them was to gun them down. And with those three, that kind of set the three pillars of gameplay that I wanted, which was exploration, puzzles, and combat. And a lot of this was space-based rather than, figuring things out mentally. You physically kind of trying to overcome these issues. So the next one was moving elements. I wanted that kind of goes hand in hand with all three of those kind of core pillars. Having elements that move means that the explorable space has means to reach it, but also there are limitations and blockages that kind of restrict your movement in certain areas until you've rerouted the power. It also gives, immediate skill challenges or regular challenges for the player to overcome. You can't get from A to C if B is in the way. So how do you overcome that? It also hopefully creates the idea of moving cover or cool traversal moments that you can get the jump on your enemies. And the last one is epic spaces. This is another thing that Pete brought up. Respawn's play spaces have a lot of depth to them. A lot of huge spaces with elements in the background, giving everything a sense of kind of it's grounded in something. It's tangible. There's a world around it. It's not just a corridor in the middle of somewhere. There's things happening around you, and something like that can give a lot of depth. It can give a lot of grandness to the space, and it gives everything kind of the idea of how you can pace gameplay elements. So how did I start? Very simply, I just wanted very simple blueprints. I wanted things moving. I wanted to be able to get in there and have the character move in the way that I wanted them to move. That was in wall running and sliding, for me personally. It's very cheap. You know, I feel like it's overused a lot, and you know, I'm guilty in this aspect. But it works, and that gave me the opportunity to kind of focus on the actual gameplay, and the movement and the flow was a big thing that I wanted to work on. Just defining simple action flow state. So once everything was running, I was able to kind of create simple actions to develop into a flowing sequence, and then develop that into a bit more of a moment of gameplay, and then build on that. Once you've got your action blocks in place, once you've kind of focused all of that into a fully operational space, you can work on that. You can develop that further, and you can add context, and you can add gameplay, and you can develop that space into everything that you need it to be. So what was next? Easy enough. Make a load of action blocks. It sounds straightforward, but that was kind of the crux of it, was just create more action blocks, create more spaces, to create opportunities for me to develop these little flowed sequences, these areas that you can explore, and different elements of gameplay that are fundamental. Some blocks you started outside and you had to make your way in to sort the power out, or some of them you started inside and you had to escape after setting the power, like the exits were blocked and things like that. So it's all about creating different but inviting and engaging moments. And that kind of brings to the final steps, which, you know, a lot of it was me taking the time to think about all of the elements from the different action blocks that I liked, that I wanted to develop further, and to put them into a cohesive level design. I started adding a lot of context to this here. So now you can see kind of this fog at the bottom. It's like, you know, I think it's used in Titanfall 2 where there's like a cryogenic space underneath, where so that limits the player from dropping down a lot. So I wanted to kind of mimic a bit of that, and just kind of, things are a bit clear, things are a bit more designed and intentional rather than experimental. Everything's got a purpose. And at this point, the bones of everything are practically finished. Everything from this point is just iteration and polish based on feedback from playtests, which is what you want, really. So with all that kind of done, what did I learn? Action blocks are great for setting out your gameplay moments in a cohesive way super quickly and getting them play tested, which is where we should all be. The overall gameplay feels better. Everything feels more intentional. The flow feels 100 times better. Things fall together, and everything kind of, it becomes more cohesive and intentional. Personally, I find it easier. I have a bit of a disconnect between 2D spaces and 3D spaces, and it's much more difficult for me to build something in a 2D top-down map and think about it that way, and then develop that into a 3D map, than it is to just get in and get it started. Which, you know, it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for me. And if I can create enjoyable, fun spaces in short amounts of time that I can develop further, you know, I should do that. Setting my limitations early was vital. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we have 1,000 things going off in our brain hundreds of different ideas every time we look at something, and limiting everything that I could do to make sure I met my criteria meant that everything was funneled down and all of the excess thoughts were kind of made redundant and everything became more of an actionable option. And it also meant that if they weren't very good, I'd only spent a few hours on them, so there was no major loss. And that's it. Thank you for listening.